The year 1819 began with a quiet, gnawing cold in Hampshire. It was a cold that did not announce itself with blustering winds or dramatic snowfalls, but seeped through the very bones of Royce Hall, a house that had long forgotten the meaning of abundance. It settled in the flagstones of the kitchens and crept up the grand, uncarpeted staircase. It ghosted through the drawing-room, where the once vibrant tapestries had faded to weary shades of grey and blue. The house was tired. It was holding on, but only just. Vivian Royce felt the cold not as a discomfort, but as a companion. At 23, she had lived with this slow, creeping decline for most of her memorable life. She knew its every nuance. The way the draught from beneath the library door smelled of damp earth, the particular shudder of the window pane in her bedchamber when the wind turned easterly, the precise number of logs one could burn to keep the chill at bay without being accused of extravagance. That morning, she sat in the small parlour that received the best of the winter sun, a basket of household linens beside her chair. Her needle moved with a practiced, steady rhythm, mending a tear in a tablecloth that was nearly as old as she was. The fabric was thin, worn soft with 1,000 washings, and the thread she used was a shade too white, a small, stark reminder of their make-do-and-mend existence. Her dress was a simple dove-grey wool, immaculately clean, but bearing the faint, ghostly outline of a seam that had been let out the year before. There was no money for new gowns. There was barely money for thread. She did not mind the work. The steady, repetitive motion of the needle was calming. It was a small act of holding things together, of imposing order on encroaching decay. While she worked, she could think. Or, more accurately, she could not think. She could simply be, a quiet presence in a quiet house, her thoughts as smooth and even as her stitches. The peace was broken by the sound of her father's footsteps, hurried and uneven, approaching down the hall. Sir Walter Royce was a man who lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade panic, a condition that had worsened as his fortunes had dwindled. He entered the parlour, his face flushed, a letter clutched in his hand like a talisman against some unseen disaster. "Vivian, there you are." He seemed surprised to find her exactly where she always was at this hour. She set her sewing aside. "Father, is something amiss?" No, not amiss. An opportunity." He waved the letter, the paper crinkling with a sound that seemed overloud in the silent room. "We have a guest arriving. This afternoon." Vivian's brows drew together slightly. Guests were a rarity at Royce Hall. They required food, fires, clean linen, all commodities in desperately short supply. "A guest? Who is it?" "A gentleman from London, a Mr. Black." He avoided her gaze, busying himself with straightening a miniature on the mantelpiece that was already perfectly straight. "He is a man of business, an investor of a sort. He is interested in the estate." The word investor hung in the air between them. Vivian knew what it meant. It meant a creditor. It meant someone was coming to look over their land, their home, their last remaining assets, and pass judgment. It meant the panic that simmered beneath the surface of their lives was about to boil over. "I see," she said, her voice betraying nothing of the cold dread that sluiced through her. "And what do you require of me?" "Just be present at dinner. Mrs. Gable is seeing to a meal." He gave a weak, unconvincing smile. "We must make a good impression. It is of the utmost importance." He paused, his eyes flicking over her plain dress. "Wear something Suitable? Vivian understood the unspoken command. Suitable meant unobtrusive. It meant she was to be a silent, well-mannered fixture, a piece of the house's fading gentility. She was not to draw attention. She was not to have opinions. She was to be a daughter, seen and not heard, a testament to a lineage that was now worth less than the paper their debts were written on. "Of course, father," she said quietly. She picked up her sewing again, her hands perfectly steady. She did not look at him as he bustled out of the room, already fretting about which of the bad sherry to serve. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend. They changed nothing. Instead, she finished her seam, folded the tablecloth with precise, economical movements, and went upstairs to her room. She looked at the small selection of gowns in her wardrobe. There was the dark blue merino, respectable, but slightly too tight across the shoulders. There was the green sarcenet from 2 seasons ago, its hem frayed. And there was the grey, her plainest dress, the one she wore for her mending, for her walks in the garden, for the quiet, unremarkable days that made up her life. It was the colour of slate, of a winter sky, of anonymity. It was, she decided, perfectly suitable. The arrival of Mr. Black's carriage was an event. It was not the carriage itself, a plain, unadorned black coach, though clearly well sprung and meticulously maintained, but the horses that drew it, 4 magnificent black geldings, their coats gleaming like polished jet, even in the flat, grey light of the afternoon. They were animals of immense power and breeding, and they made the Royces' own aging mare, grazing listlessly in the paddock, look like a creature from another, lesser species. Vivian watched from the landing window as 2 grooms, liveried in a sober dark grey, expertly managed the team. A man emerged from the coach. He was tall, dressed in a travelling coat of dark wool that seemed to absorb the light. He did not look around at the crumbling facade of Royce Hall or the weed-choked gravel of the drive. He simply stood for a moment, a figure of stark, angular stillness, before turning towards the front door, which her father was already pulling open with a show of welcome that bordered on frantic. Vivian took a deep breath, the air thin and cold in her lungs. She smoothed the skirt of her grey dress. It was time to play her part. She descended the stairs as the men were entering the hall. Her father was talking, a nervous, effusive stream of words about the journey, the weather, the miserable state of the roads. The visitor, Mr. Black, said nothing. He handed his hat and gloves to the elderly butler, Ames, without a word, his movements economical and precise. Then he looked up, and his eyes met Vivian's. They were grey, not the soft grey of her dress, but the hard, flinty grey of storm clouds over a winter sea. They were intelligent, assessing, and utterly unreadable. For a single, unnerving second, she felt as though he saw everything. The worn stone of the floor, the threadbare patch on her father's coat, the carefully mended tear in the tablecloth she had just folded away. He saw the whole shabby truth of their lives. "My daughter, Vivian," Sir Walter said, turning to her with a relieved smile. "Vivian, this is Mr. Black." The man gave a slight, formal inclination of his head. He did not smile. "Miss Royce." His voice was a low baritone, as devoid of ornamentation as his clothing. "Mr. Black," she replied, her own voice quiet but clear. She curtsied, the movement graceful despite the years since she had last done so in any formal company. There was a silence, not a comfortable one. Sir Walter rushed to fill it, ushering their guest towards the drawing-room, where a small, carefully husbanded fire was burning. Vivian followed, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She felt the stranger's gaze on her back, not in a manner that was improper, but in a way that was analytical, as if he were calculating her worth. Dinner was a trial. Mrs. Gable, their cook and housekeeper, had performed a small miracle, producing a passable soup, a roasted chicken, and a baked apple pudding. But the tension at the table could have curdled cream. Sir Walter kept the conversation going almost single-handedly, speaking of crop rotations and local politics, his voice growing louder and more desperate with every monosyllabic response from their guest. Mr. Black, she could not think of him as anything else, ate with a focused, deliberate air. He did not compliment the food, but he cleaned his plate. He drank the bad sherry without flinching. His gaze moved around the room, noting the water stain on the ceiling, the chip in the rim of his glass, the way the candlelight flickered in the draught from the ill-fitting windows. He was not merely a guest. He was an inspector, an auditor of their ruin. He addressed Vivian only once, his voice cutting cleanly through her father's rambling anecdote about a prize-winning pig from a decade earlier. "The gardens, Miss Royce," he said. "Do you take an interest in them?" Vivian was startled. She had been so thoroughly relegated to the role of silent observer that a direct question felt like a breach of protocol. "I do, sir," she answered, "though our head gardener retired some years ago, and we have not been able to replace him." "So you manage them yourself?" "I do what I can," she said simply. "The vegetable garden is productive enough for our needs. The roses require more attention than I can currently give them." He nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Pragmatism over beauty. A sensible choice." It was not a compliment, not precisely. It was a statement of fact, an observation. Yet it was the first time all evening that anyone had said something that felt true. She met his gaze across the table. For a fleeting instant, she had the sense of being seen. Not as a baronet's daughter, not as a decorative piece, but as a person who made practical choices. The feeling was so unfamiliar, it was disorienting. After the meal, she excused herself, leaving the men to their port, or in this case, the last of the tolerable brandy. She knew the real conversation was about to begin. She went not to the drawing-room, but to the library. It was her sanctuary, a large, cold room lined with shelves of books that were her only inheritance of any real value. The air smelled of old paper and leather and dust. Here, the pretense of Royce Hall fell away, and it was simply a place of quiet, scholarly decay. She did not light a lamp. She stood by the tall window, looking out at the moon-silvered lawn. She did not know how long she stood there. 1 hour. 2. The house was utterly silent. Finally, she heard the library door open. It was her father. He looked older than he had that morning, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and haggard in the moonlight. "He has made an offer," Sir Walter said, his voice a dry whisper. Vivian turned from the window. "To buy the estate?" She tried to keep her own voice steady. "No." Her father sank into a worn leather armchair, the springs groaning in protest. "No, not to buy it. To save it. He took a shuddering breath. "Vivian, we are ruined. Utterly. The debts they are beyond anything I have told you. We will be turned out by spring. Everything will be seized." The words were stark, but not surprising. She had known the substance of it for years. She had simply not known the timeline. Spring. It was only a few months away. "And Mr. Black's offer?" she prompted gently. Her father would not meet her eyes. He stared at his hands, which were twisting together in his lap. "His name is not Black. That is the name his man of business uses when he wishes to travel without." Notice. A cold knot formed in Vivian's stomach. "He is Philip de Lacy," her father continued, the name falling like a stone into the quiet room. "The Duke of Velmore." Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. A duke, not a creditor, not a merchant, but one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in England. Here, in their shabby dining room, eating their stringy chicken, his presence an absurdity, a contradiction that made no sense. Why? "He needs a wife," her father said, the words coming in a rush now, tumbling over one another in his haste to be done with it. "A duchess. He is the last of his line. It is his duty. He has no time for the nonsense of the London season, for a protracted courtship with some society belle and her ambitious mother. He wants it done, quietly, quickly." Vivian stood frozen, the moonlight painting a silver stripe across the floor between them. She understood. She understood with a sickening, crystalline clarity. "He wants to marry me," she said. "It was not a question. He will settle all my debts," her father whispered, his voice cracking. "Every last one. He will provide a generous income for me for the rest of my life. He will see that Royce Hall is maintained. In return, he got a baronet's daughter, a woman with an impeccable lineage and no troublesome family to interfere, a woman so desperate she would not, could not say no, a bride purchased as cleanly and efficiently as a prize mare." She thought of the Duke's assessing gaze, his comment in the dining room. Pragmatism over beauty. A sensible choice. She was a sensible choice. A practical solution to his dynastic problem. "He wishes for an answer in the morning," Sir Walter finished lamely. He finally looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Vivian, there is no other way." She looked away from him, back towards the window. The moon was high and cold, the landscape stark and unforgiving. She thought of her home, of the worn flagstones and faded tapestries. She thought of her father, weak and foolish, but still her father, facing debtor's prison. She thought of the rest of her life, a slow, grinding descent into impoverished spinsterhood. And she thought of the Duke of Velmore, a man as cold and hard as the winter landscape. A stranger. Her choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. But it would be hers to make. She turned back to her father, her expression composed, her voice steady. "Please inform His Grace that I will require a moment of his time before breakfast. I have a few terms of my own." The Duke of Velmore received her in the library. He was already dressed, standing by the very window where she had stood hours before. The pale morning light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the severe cut of his dark coat. He looked less like a guest and more like he had already taken ownership of the room, of the house. He turned as she entered. His grey eyes were, if possible, even more remote than they had been the night before. "Miss Royce." "Your Grace," she said, giving a small curtsy. Her voice was calm. She had not slept, but her mind felt sharp, clear. My father has conveyed your proposal. He has. It was a flat statement. He did not ask for her answer. He simply waited. I find the terms acceptable, with two conditions. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise? Annoyance? It was gone before she could be certain. Indeed. First, she said, meeting his gaze directly, my father's debts are to be settled in full, but he is to be given a fixed allowance, managed by your man of business. He is not to be given control of a large sum of money. It would not be prudent. She was protecting her father from himself, a role she had played her entire life. The Duke considered this for a moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. A sensible precaution. Agreed. And the second condition? Here she took a breath. This was for herself. I will be your wife, and I will perform the duties of a duchess to the best of my ability. I will provide you with an heir, if God is willing. But I will not be a decorative object. I am not a doll to be dressed up and displayed. I will have purpose. I require meaningful work, the management of your households, a role in the administration of your estates. I will be your partner, not your possession. The silence stretched. It was a bold demand, a shocking one. She was a destitute baronet's daughter, and she was dictating terms to a duke. She expected a cold refusal, a dismissal. Instead, he watched her, a strange, calculating look on his face. He seemed to be reassessing her, recalibrating his initial judgment. You believe the running of a ducal household to be meaningful work? He asked, a faint, almost imperceptible note of irony in his voice. I believe that any work done well has meaning, she countered evenly. And I believe that a house, like a garden, thrives on attention and care. I am capable of providing it. Your households will be run with efficiency, economy, and grace. That will be my contribution to this arrangement. He was quiet for a long time. 1 second, 2, 3. She did not look away. She would not. Finally, he spoke. Very well, Miss Royce. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. It seems we have a bargain. He extended his hand. It was not a gesture of courtship, but of contract, a deal being sealed. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, his skin cool. We do, Your Grace. The name, he said, his voice flat, is Philip. She withdrew her hand. I will learn to use it in time. The marriage was as swift and impersonal as the proposal. A special license was procured from London with breathtaking speed. 2 days later, Vivian stood in the cold, damp parish church beside a man she barely knew and pledged her life to him. She wore the same grey dress. It seemed appropriate. It was the dress of a woman undertaking a serious, sober task, not a bride embarking on a romance. Her father wept quietly in the front pew. Philip, Duke of Velmore, was as still and impassive as a statue. After the short ceremony, there was no celebration, no wedding breakfast. Vivian changed into her dark blue merino, her best gown, now her travelling dress, and took her leave of Royce Hall. Her possessions fit into a single, modest trunk. As she climbed into the Duke's perfectly sprung coach, she did not look back. Looking back was a luxury she could not afford. The journey to Fardale, the Duke's primary country seat in Oxfordshire, was undertaken in near total silence. Philip, she could not bring herself to think his name without a sense of unreality, did not seem to expect conversation. He read a slim volume bound in dark leather, his attention absolute. Vivian sat opposite, watching the landscape slide by, a blur of skeletal winter trees and frost-hardened fields. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play in which she had been inexplicably cast. She was now the Duchess of Velmore. The title felt like a costume she was wearing, one that did not fit and never would. She was Vivian Royce, a mender of tablecloths, a tender of vegetable gardens. She was a woman who knew the price of candles and the exact moment a log should be added to a fire. What did such a woman know of being a duchess? They arrived at Fardale as dusk was falling. The coach turned off the main road, through magnificent wrought-iron gates, held open by a gatekeeper who bowed so low his head nearly touched his knees. They proceeded down a drive that seemed to stretch for miles, flanked by ancient oaks. And then the house appeared. It was not a house. It was a palace, a vast, sprawling edifice of pale stone, with wings that reached out like arms to embrace the manicured parkland. Hundreds of windows, arranged in perfect, symmetrical rows, stared out into the twilight. As they drew up to the grand entrance, lights bloomed in the downstairs windows, one after another, as if in silent, coordinated salute. The front doors, twice the height of a tall man, were opened by a butler who looked as ancient and imposing as the house itself. A line of servants, perhaps 20 or 30 of them, stood arrayed in the entrance hall. They were a sea of black and white uniforms, their faces impassive, their posture rigid. The hall itself was cavernous. A black and white marble floor stretched into the distance, a grand staircase sweeping upwards into the shadows. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, decorated with ornate plasterwork. It was magnificent. It was breathtaking. And it was as cold and impersonal as a mausoleum. Philip led her inside, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the immense space. "This is Hargrove," he said, indicating the butler. "He has been with my family for 50 years. You will find the household runs efficiently." Hargrove bowed. "Your Grace, welcome to Fardale." His eyes, small and bright in his wrinkled face, flickered over Vivian for a fraction of a second, taking in her simple dress, her single trunk, her lack of a lady's maid. His expression did not change, but Vivian felt the judgment, silent and absolute. She was not what they had expected. "My wife will require a suite in the West Wing," Philip instructed, "and a suitable lady's maid is to be found." "Of course, Your Grace." A formidable woman in a black silk dress and a starched white cap stepped forward. "I am Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, Your Grace," she said to Vivian, her voice crisp. "If you will follow me." Vivian looked at her husband. He gave a slight, dismissive nod. She was being handed over, passed from one set of staff to another. She had not expected warmth, but the sheer, chilling formality of it all was a shock. This was her home now, and she was a stranger in it. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." Her rooms were beautiful. A sitting room, a bedroom, a dressing room, all furnished with exquisite French furniture, silk wall coverings, and thick Aubusson carpets. A fire burned brightly in the hearth, but it did little to warm the vast, high-ceilinged space. From her window, she could see a formal garden, its geometric patterns stark under a rising moon. A young maid named Lucy was assigned to her, a nervous girl with wide, frightened eyes. She helped Vivian unpack her few belongings, her hands trembling as she handled the worn wool and mended cotton. The contents of Vivian's trunk looked pitiful and absurd, laid out in the grandeur of the dressing room. That night, she dined alone in her sitting room, served by a silent footman. The Duke, she was informed, always dined in his study when in the country. She was an inconvenience, a disruption to his established routine. The days that followed fell into a strange, dislocated pattern. Vivian was a ghost in her own home. She would wake, be dressed by the terrified Lucy, and eat breakfast alone. She would walk through the endless, silent corridors, her footsteps swallowed by the thick carpets. She would see servants who would flatten themselves against the walls and avert their eyes as she passed. She was the Duchess, a figure of immense authority, yet she felt utterly powerless. She had no role, no purpose. She was exactly what she had feared she would become, a decorative object, left on a shelf to be ignored. Philip remained a distant, formidable presence. She saw him only occasionally, a glimpse of him crossing the great hall or riding out towards the home farm, his back ramrod straight. They did not speak. He had purchased his bride, installed her in his house, and now, it seemed, he was content to forget she existed. The library became her only refuge. It was even larger than the one at Royce Hall, 2 stories high, with a gallery running around the upper level. It was filled with thousands of books, their leather spines gleaming in the light from the tall, arched windows. Here, at least, she felt a sense of peace. The books did not judge her. They did not care that her gown was 2 seasons out of date, or that her dowry had been a mountain of debt. She began to explore the collection, her fingers tracing the titles. History, philosophy, science, poetry. The collection was vast and eclectic, a record of generations of De Lacy minds. She found a section on horticulture and estate management, and began to read, devouring the texts with a hunger she had not realized she possessed. She was learning the language of her new world, not from its people, but from its books. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, she was sitting in a window seat, deep in a treatise on crop rotation, when she looked up and found him standing there. The Duke. He was watching her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. She had not heard him approach. I was not aware my collection included such practical texts, he said, his voice quiet. Vivian closed the book, her heart beating a little faster. Your great-grandfather appears to have had a keen interest in agricultural reform, she said, her voice steady. He walked into the room, his gaze sweeping over the shelves. He believed a man's duty was to his land first, and his title second. He stopped a few feet from her, looking at the book in her lap. Do you find it interesting? I find it logical, she said. Land requires the same thing as a household, a plan, diligent oversight, an understanding of its nature. He looked at her then, a long, considering look. You are not what I expected, Miss Royce. It is your Grace now, she reminded him softly, or Vivian, as you wish. You are not what I expected, he repeated, as if she had not spoken. I had anticipated tears, complaints, demands for jewels and trips to Paris. I am not a child, Your Grace, she said, a hint of steel in her voice. We made a bargain. I intend to keep my side of it. I asked for meaningful work. Since none has been offered, I have sought to educate myself for when it is. He was silent for a moment. She had challenged him, subtly but unmistakably. She had reminded him of her second condition. Hargrove and Mrs. Davies run this house as it has been run for a century, he said finally. I have no doubt they are exceptionally competent, Vivian replied. But this is not just a house. It is our home, and a home should have a heart. Fardale has a magnificent, perfectly functioning clockwork mechanism, but it has no heart. She had gone too far. She knew it the moment the words were out. She had criticized his home, his heritage. She braced herself for a cold, cutting reply. Instead, he turned and looked around the vast, silent library. He looked at the perfectly ordered shelves, the gleaming furniture, the cold, majestic space. And for the first time, Vivian thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. A loneliness that mirrored her own. No, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It has not had a heart for a very long time. He turned and walked out of the library, leaving her alone with the silent books and the echo of his words. From the Duke's perspective, the woman he had married was a constant, low-level source of confusion. Philip de Lacy was a man who prized order, logic, and control. His life was a series of duties to be performed, obligations to be met. His proposal to Vivian Royce had been a logical solution to a pressing problem. He required an heir. He required a duchess to preside over his table. A quiet, well-bred girl from a ruined family was the most efficient option. No messy emotions, no ambitious mama, no endless, tedious courtship. It was a transaction. He had expected her to be either crushed by her circumstances or nakedly grasping. Instead, she was still. A quiet, self-contained presence in his house. He was aware of her in a way that he had not anticipated. He would see her walking in the frosted gardens, a solitary figure in a plain dress. He would hear from Hargrove that she had requested access to the household account books. He found her in his library, reading not novels, but agricultural science. She asked for nothing. She did not complain of her isolation. She did not demand new gowns or jewels. Her quiet dignity was a puzzle. It was also, he was reluctant to admit, an irritant. It made his own cold, transactional view of their marriage feel incomplete, churlish. Her comment in the library had unsettled him more than he would ever let on. It has no heart. She was right, of course. Fardale had been a place of duty and grief since his parents' death years ago. He had maintained it, run it with the precision of an army barracks, but he had never truly lived in it. He had sealed himself off in his study, in his work, just as he had sealed off his own emotions. And this quiet, observant woman had seen it in less than a fortnight. She saw him, and he was not sure he liked it. A few days later, Hargrove approached him in his study. The butler's face was, as always, impassive, but there was a stiffness in his posture that betrayed his agitation. Your Grace, the Duchess has made a request. Philip looked up from his ledgers. What is it? She has requested that the long dining table be removed from the family dining room. Philip frowned. The table was a magnificent piece of mahogany, capable of seating 30. It had been in that room for 200 years. Removed, and replaced with what? A small round table from the morning room, Your Grace. She says it will be cozier. The word cozier sounded alien and faintly ridiculous in Hargrove's mouth. Philip was about to issue a flat refusal. It was an absurd whim, an inconvenience. But then he remembered her words. A home should have a heart. He pictured the long, polished expanse of that table. He had eaten at it alone for years, a solitary figure at one end, the empty chairs stretching away like tombstones. He had never considered it strange before. It was simply the way things were. He looked at the dinner invitation on his desk. A missive from his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, announcing her imminent arrival from London. She would be expecting to meet his new bride. The thought of the three of them sitting at that vast table, shouting at each other across an ocean of mahogany, was suddenly deeply unappealing. "See to it," he said curtly. Hargrove's eyebrows shot up a fraction of an inch, the most extreme display of emotion Philip had ever seen from him. "Your Grace?" "You heard me, Hargrove. Do as the Duchess asks." That evening, when Philip entered the family dining room, the great table was gone. In its place stood a small, circular table, laid for two. A simple vase of winter jasmine, which Vivian must have found in the conservatory, stood in the centre. The room felt entirely different, smaller, intimate. Vivian was already there, standing by the fire. She was wearing a dark green dress he had not seen before. It was as simple as her others, but the colour brought out the warmth in her hazel eyes. She looked up as he entered, a flicker of uncertainty on her face. "I hope you do not mind the change, Your Grace," she said. He walked to the table and pulled out a chair for her. It was a simple courtesy, one he had not performed in years. "It is an improvement." The silence over dinner was different that night. It was no longer a vast, empty chasm between them, but a shared, companionable quiet. The physical proximity made conversation feel not just possible, but necessary. "The book you were reading," he began, surprising himself. "The one on crop rotation. What did you learn?" She looked up, startled by the question. She began to speak, hesitantly at first, then with more confidence, about the theories of four-field systems and the importance of soil replenishment. She was not lecturing. She was sharing information. Her voice was low and musical, her explanations clear and concise. He found himself listening, truly listening, not just to her words, but to the intelligence and passion behind them. She cared about these things, about making things grow, about making things better. For the first time since she had arrived, he saw her not as Miss Royce, the baronet's daughter, or the Duchess of Velmore, the solution to his problem. He saw Vivian, a woman with a quick, curious mind and a quiet, formidable strength. And he felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a very long time. Interest. The arrival of the Dowager Duchess of Velmore a week later was like the arrival of a small, perfectly dressed whirlwind. Lady Hortense was a woman in her 70s, with eyes as sharp and bright as a bird's, and a tongue to match. She swept into Fardale, took one look at the round table in the dining room, another at Vivian's simple gown, and a third at the infinitesimally less rigid expression on her grandson's face, and understood the entire situation at a glance. She cornered Vivian in the drawing room that afternoon. "So," she said, her voice brisk, "you're the girl my fool of a grandson bought. Tell me, are you terrified of him?" Vivian, who had been steeling herself for a formidable matriarch, was taken aback by the directness. "I am not, Your Grace." "Good. No point being frightened of Philip. He's all bark and no bite. Just a great deal of very quiet, very cold bark." The dowager peered at her. "He tells me you demanded to run the household. Have you started yet?" "I have been studying the account books," Vivian admitted. "Books? Books," Lady Hortense snorted. "A house isn't run from books, child. It's run from the kitchens and the still room. Come with me." And with that, the Dowager Duchess swept Vivian off on a tour of the domestic heart of Fardale. She marched into the kitchens, tasted the soup, interrogated Mrs. Davies about the price of butter, and praised the polish on the copper pots. She treated the staff with a mixture of terrifying authority and genuine respect. She knew their names, asked after their families. She was the heart Vivian had said was missing, returned and beating strongly, and she took Vivian under her wing. "You have good sense," she declared at the end of the day. "And you aren't a fool. That puts you ahead of 90% of the women in London. But your wardrobe is a disaster." "It is what I have," Vivian said simply. "It is not what a duchess has," the dowager corrected her. "We're going to London. It's time Philip showed off his new bride. And we, my dear, are going to show the ton that the new Duchess of Velmore is not some frightened country mouse." The move to London was a seismic shift. Velmore House in Mayfair was even more grand and imposing than Fardale. And unlike the quiet country, London was a cacophony of noise, people, and expectation. The season was beginning, and the news of the Duke's surprise marriage had spread like wildfire. The dowager was true to her word. A modiste was summoned. Bolts of silk, satin, and muslin filled Vivian's new sitting room. Vivian, accustomed to making a single gown last for years, was bewildered by the sheer volume of it all. But under Lady Hortense's expert guidance, she chose fabrics and styles that were elegant and understated, refusing the frills and flounces that were the height of fashion. She chose creams, deep blues, soft greens, and one magnificent gown of silver grey silk. "You have good taste," the dowager approved. "You know what suits you. Simplicity is its own form of power." Philip, to Vivian's surprise, seemed to approve. He had been spending his days at his club or in the House of Lords, but he was present for dinner every evening. He saw her in one of her new gowns, a simple cream silk that shimmered in the candlelight. He stopped for a moment, his gaze travelling over her. "You look well, Vivian," he said, the use of her first name still slightly formal on his tongue. "Thank you, Philip," she replied, and the name felt a little more natural on hers. Their first major social outing was a ball at the home of the Marquess of Amberley. Vivian's stomach was in knots. This was the true test. She was about to be presented to the society that Philip had so desperately wished to avoid. As she descended the staircase to meet him and his grandmother, she felt a moment of panic. She was an imposter, a girl in a borrowed costume. Philip was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up, and for a moment his cool composure broke. He simply stared. She was wearing the silver grey silk. It was cut simply, but the fabric clung to her figure and shimmered with every movement, catching the light like moonbeams on water. Her dark hair was dressed in a simple chignon, her only ornament a small string of pearls, a gift from the dowager, at her throat. She was not beautiful in the dazzling, fashionable way of the London belles. She was beautiful in a way that was quieter, more profound, a beauty that was about stillness and grace. "Vivian," he said, his voice husky. He offered her his arm. His touch, through his glove, was warm and firm. The ballroom was a dazzling, overwhelming assault on the senses. Hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with perfume and the buzz of 1,000 conversations. As the Duke of Velmore and his new, unknown Duchess were announced, a wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. Every eye was on them. On her. Vivian kept her head high, her hand resting lightly on Philip's arm. She could feel the curiosity, the speculation, the outright hostility from some quarters. It was not long before the source of that hostility made herself known. Lady Camilla Anselm was widely considered the most beautiful woman in London. She had golden hair, eyes the colour of violets, and a fortune of her own. It had been an open secret for 2 seasons that she and her ambitious mother had set their sights on the Duke of Velmore. His sudden marriage had been a public, humiliating blow. She approached them, a sweet, malicious smile on her perfect lips. "Your Grace," she said to Philip, her voice like honey laced with poison. "You have been keeping secrets from us." Her gaze swept over Vivian, a slow, deliberate appraisal that took in the simple gown, the minimal jewelry, the quiet demeanour. "And this must be your Duchess." The word was an insult. "Lady Camilla," Philip said, his voice arctic. "Allow me to present my wife, the Duchess of Velmore." "How charming," Camilla purred. "We had heard you had married, of course. Such a romantic story. A whirlwind affair, was it not? One hardly knows what to believe." Her eyes glittered. "Tell me, Duchess, do you find London overwhelming? It must be so very different from wherever it is you come from." "I find London is much like a poorly managed garden, Lady Camilla," Vivian replied, her voice perfectly calm. "A great deal of noise and colour, but lacking in genuine substance. One must be careful to cultivate what is worthwhile and weed out the rest." Camilla's smile tightened. She had expected a stammering, intimidated country girl. She had not expected this cool, direct response. For a moment, she was wrong-footed. Philip's hand tightened ever so slightly on Vivian's arm. It was a gesture of approval, of alliance. He led her away, leaving Camilla staring after them, her violet eyes narrowed in fury. The encounter set the tone for the weeks that followed. Camilla and her circle of friends waged a subtle war of attrition. There were snubs in the park, invitations that failed to arrive, pointed comments made just loud enough for Vivian to overhear. They spoke of her plain dress, her lack of dowry, her family's unfortunate circumstances. Vivian bore it with the same quiet dignity she had shown from the beginning. She did not complain to Philip. She did not engage in gossip. With the Dowager as her guide and shield, she navigated the treacherous waters of the Tun. She found a small circle of her own. Quieter, more intellectual people who were drawn to her intelligence and her lack of artifice. Philip watched it all. He saw the snubs, heard the whispers, and he found himself growing angry, a cold, protective rage he had never experienced before. An insult to Vivian was an insult to him. He had married her for convenience, but he would not stand by and watch her be humiliated. She was his wife. She was the Duchess of Velmore. She was his. The realization was a profound shock. His feelings for her were no longer logical or transactional. They were emotional, protective, possessive. He found himself looking for her in crowded rooms, his evening incomplete until he saw her. He found himself lingering over dinner, drawing her into conversations about politics, literature, and even the gardens at Fardale. He was discovering the woman he had married, and he was captivated by what he found. One night, he was working late in his London study, wrestling with a complex piece of legislation. The house was quiet. He was tired, the words on the page blurring before his eyes. The door opened softly. It was Vivian. She was carrying a tray with a pot of tea and a single cup. She did not speak. She simply set the tray on the corner of his desk, poured him a cup, and placed it beside his hand. "I thought you might need this," she said quietly. He looked up at her. She was in her dressing gown, her dark hair unbound and falling over her shoulders. She looked soft and lovely in the lamplight. In this quiet, unguarded moment, she was not the Duchess, and he was not the Duke. They were just a man and a woman in a quiet house. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. She nodded and turned to leave. "Vivian, wait," he said, his voice stopping her at the door. She turned back, her expression questioning. He did not know what he wanted to say. "Thank you for the tea. Thank you for not being what I expected. Thank you for bringing a heart back into my houses, into my life." The words were a jumble in his mind, impossible to utter. Instead, he just looked at her. And in that look, something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition of the fragile, tentative bond that was growing between them. She gave him a small, true smile, the first he had ever seen. It transformed her face, lighting it from within. "Good night, Philip," she said softly, and closed the door behind her. He sat for a long time, the tea growing cold in its cup, his ledgers forgotten. He had married for duty, for convenience. He had married a sensible choice. And somehow, against all logic and expectation, he was falling in love with his wife. The campaign against Vivian reached its ugly crescendo. Lady Camilla, furious at her failure to intimidate the new Duchess, and enraged by the Duke's clear and growing affection for his wife, decided to escalate her tactics from social snubs to outright slander. A rumor began to circulate, starting as a whisper in a lady's boudoir and spreading through the drawing rooms of Mayfair with vicious speed. The story was that the Royce family had not merely been in debt. Sir Walter had been involved in a fraudulent scheme, a piece of city speculation that had ruined dozens of smaller investors. The tale claimed the Duke of Velmore had not married Vivian out of some bizarre whim, but because he had been blackmailed into it, forced to save the Royce name, to prevent a scandal that would have touched upon his own family's dealings. It was a clever lie, containing just enough truth, the Royce family's ruin, to make the rest of it seem plausible. It cast Vivian not as a quiet country girl, but as the conniving daughter of a criminal. It painted Philip not as a man in love, but as a victim. The Dowager Duchess heard the rumor first, and was incandescent with rage. "That venomous little viper," she hissed, pacing her drawing room. "Camilla Anselm has the morals of an alley cat and the subtlety of a charging bull. Philip must call her father out." "No," Vivian said, her voice quiet but firm. She was pale, but her hands were steady in her lap. A duel would only give the story more credence. It would turn a whisper into a roar. "Then what do you propose to do?" Hortense demanded. "You cannot simply let them say these things." I propose to do nothing, Vivian said. I will continue as I have. To deny the rumour is to acknowledge it has power. I will not give it that. But the poison had been spread. Vivian felt the change immediately. The stares were no longer just curious. They were hostile. Ladies who had been warming to her now turned their backs when she entered a room. The atmosphere grew thick with suspicion. The final public blow came at a musical. As Vivian moved to take a seat, the woman next to her, a friend of Camilla's, rose abruptly and said, in a voice that carried, I find the air in here has suddenly become tainted. I must move. She swept away, leaving Vivian sitting alone, a circle of empty chairs around her like a quarantine. Philip, who was standing across the room, saw the whole exchange. He saw the deliberate, public cruelty. He saw the flicker of pain in Vivian's eyes before she schooled her features back into a mask of calm composure. And the cold rage he had been nursing for weeks solidified into something hard and unyielding. He crossed the room in a few long strides, ignoring the sudden hush that fell over the chattering crowd. He stopped before Vivian, held out his hand, and said, his voice clear and resonant, My dear, I find this music tedious. Will you walk with me in the garden? He did not wait for an answer. He simply took her hand, tucked it into the crook of his arm, and led her from the room. It was a public, unequivocal declaration of support. He had chosen his side. He had chosen her. In the cool night air of the garden, away from the prying eyes, Vivian's composure finally trembled. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. They will not break you, Philip said, his voice low and fierce. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her arms. Do you hear me, Vivian? We will not let them. Why does she hate me so? Vivian whispered. I have done nothing to her. You exist, Philip said grimly. You took what she believed was hers by right. Her hatred has nothing to do with you, and everything to do with her own thwarted ambition. It is ugly, and it is cruel, and I will not have it touch you. He looked down at her, at the woman who had faced down her family's ruin, his own coldness, and the viciousness of an entire society, with nothing but her own quiet courage. The love he felt for her was a physical ache in his chest. We are hosting the Midsummer Ball in a fortnight, he said. It is the most significant event of the season. You will not hide. You will stand beside me as my Duchess, and we will face them down together. A new strength flowed through Vivian, ignited by his fierce loyalty. He was her husband, her partner, her ally. She was not alone. Yes, she said, her voice clear again. Together. The night of the Velmore Midsummer Ball arrived. It was the most anticipated event of the London season, and the whole of the ton was in attendance. The ballroom at Velmore House was a spectacle of flowers and light, the scent of thousands of roses and lilies mingling with beeswax and perfume. An orchestra played from the minstrel's gallery. Jewels glittered on necks and wrists, a river of diamonds flowing through the room. But beneath the glittering surface, the tension was palpable. Everyone knew this was to be the final act in the drama between the new Duchess and the vanquished Lady Camilla. Camilla had made sure of it, arriving early and positioning herself at the center of the most influential group of gossips. She was a vision in a gown of brilliant, defiant sapphire, her golden hair dressed with diamonds. She was holding court, her laughter a little too loud, her smile a little too bright. She was a general, surveying the battlefield before the final charge. Vivian and Philip made their entrance. A hush fell. Vivian was not wearing the crown jewels of the Velmore dynasty, as some had expected. She was not trying to outshine Camilla. She was wearing a gown of the palest ivory silk, almost the colour of moonlight. It was exquisitely cut, but devoid of ornamentation. Her only jewels were the simple pearls at her throat and a matching pair at her ears. Her dark hair was coiled in its simple, elegant chignon. She was an island of serene simplicity in an ocean of rococo extravagance. She did not look like a woman on the defensive. She looked like a queen in her own court. Philip was at her side, his presence a silent, formidable bulwark. He did not glower or look for confrontation. He was simply there, his attention focused entirely on his wife. He greeted his guests with his usual cool courtesy, but his hand never left the small of Vivian's back, a constant, reassuring pressure. They began to circulate. The snubs were less overt here, in the Duke's own home, but the chill was still there. Conversations would halt as they approached. Eyes would slide away. Camilla watched it all, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. The moment came, as they all knew it would. Camilla detached herself from her circle and approached them near the French doors that led to the terrace. Her friends followed at a slight distance, an audience for the kill. "Your Grace," she said to Vivian, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You are looking a little pale. I do hope the pressures of the season are not proving too much for you. It must be so difficult, trying to live down a family's reputation." The insult was direct, public, and utterly vicious. The small circle of listeners gasped. This was it. Vivian met her gaze. She did not flush or stammer. Her expression was one of cool pity. "On the contrary, Lady Camilla," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. "I find that a clear conscience is a remarkable tonic for the constitution. You should try it sometime." Before Camilla could retort, Philip stepped forward. He did not address Camilla at all. He ignored her as if she were a piece of furniture. His eyes were only for his wife. "Vivian," he said, his voice low and rich, audible only to those nearby. "I believe this is our waltz." He took her hand, raised it to his lips, and kissed it with a reverence that stunned the onlookers. Then he turned to the room and spoke, his voice effortlessly commanding the attention of every person there. "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen," he began, "may I have your attention?" The room fell utterly silent. "Many of you this season have had the pleasure of meeting my wife, the Duchess of Velmore." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before coming to rest, with burning intensity, on Vivian's face. "But I am not sure you have truly seen her. You may have seen a quiet woman. You may have heard whispers and rumour, the usual currency of this town. But I have seen a woman of unparalleled grace, formidable intelligence, and a courage that would put soldiers to shame. I entered into this marriage for reasons of duty and convenience. I stand here tonight as the luckiest and most undeserving of men, for those reasons have been eclipsed by a love I did not believe myself capable of feeling." He held out his hand to her. "Vivian, my darling wife, will you grant me the honour of this dance?" It was a complete, total, and public declaration. Not just of support, but of love. He had stripped himself of his ducal armour and shown them his heart. Tears welled in Vivian's eyes as she placed her hand in his. "Yes, Philip," she whispered. "Yes." He led her to the center of the floor. As the orchestra struck up the first notes of the waltz, the other dancers melted away, clearing the floor until they were alone. He put his arm around her waist, drew her close, and they began to dance. They moved as one, two figures in a circle of light, oblivious to the hundreds of eyes upon them. He looked only at her. "I was a fool," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I offered you a bargain when I should have offered you my heart. Can you ever forgive me?" "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her hand tightening on his shoulder. She looked up at him, her love for him shining in her eyes. "You saw me, Philip, when no one else did. You saw me." Across the room, Lady Camilla stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. She had been rendered invisible. The Duke had not even deigned to look at her. Her power, built on whispers and malice, had evaporated in the face of his open, honest declaration. She was nothing. In a room full of people, she was utterly, devastatingly alone. For a moment, the mask slipped, and a look of raw, panicked loss crossed her face. Then, with a choked sound, she turned and fled the ballroom, her social ruin complete. But Vivian and Philip did not see it. They saw only each other, turning and turning in the center of the floor, their two separate lives finally, irrevocably, becoming one. The late summer sun warmed the stone terraces of Fardale. The gardens, under Vivian's careful planning, and the guidance of a new, energetic head gardener she had hired, were beginning to bloom with a life and color the old house had not seen in decades. The formal patterns were still there, but they were softened now, with drifts of lavender and unruly, fragrant roses. The house felt different. It was breathing again. Vivian sat on a stone bench, a book lying forgotten in her lap. She was watching Philip, who was crouched down, examining a newly planted damask rose with an expression of intense concentration. He had become as fascinated by the restoration of the gardens as she was, spending hours with her planning and planting. He looked up and caught her watching him, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a true smile now, one that reached his grey eyes and made them warm. He came over and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "It's a good rose," he said. "Strong. It will do well here." "I knew it would," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. The ease between them was a quiet miracle, a gift she cherished every day. The world of London, of Camilla, of the whispers and the stares, felt a lifetime away. Here, there was only the sun, the scent of flowers, and the steady, comforting presence of her husband. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The noise? The parties?" She smiled. "I miss the Dowager, but I do not miss the rest. My life is here." She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. "My life is with you." He brought her hand to his lips, just as he had on the night of the ball. The gesture still made her heart beat faster. "I love you, Vivian," he said, his voice low and certain. "I think I loved you from the moment you stood in that dusty library and told me my house had no heart. You were the first person to tell me the truth in years." "I only said what I saw," she whispered. "And you are the only one who ever truly saw me," he replied. He looked out over the gardens, at the great house behind them, no longer a cold mausoleum, but a warm, living home. "You brought the heart back, my love. to Fardale, and to me. She thought of the girl in the plain grey dress, mending a tablecloth in a cold, tired house. Her future, a blank grey page. And she thought of the woman she was now, the Duchess of Velmore, loved and cherished, sitting in the sun with her husband. It was not a bargain or a transaction. It was a life she had built not with jewels or titles, but with quiet dignity, with patience, and with the stubborn, resilient power of a single, well-tended rose. Thank you for listening to the story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.